Before we go to soteriology, which is the doctrine of salvation, we need to be really clear on man and sin. And so that's where we left off. We've already talked about the fall, what happened at the fall, what the problem was with man's rebellion. I want to call it rebellion, his disobedience. Not just man, but man and woman. I usually use man when I'm teaching theology in the generic sense. But just in this case, I thought I better make sure you understand it's mankind that sinned. Though God held Adam primarily responsible as the federal head of the human race. I see Sarah already has a question or a comment.
Just tell you a fun thing before we get started. I was telling a friend that while we were studying in Sunday school, and I said we've been studying man, and we were going to move on to studying salvation. And they said, "Oh, I thought you were going to say you were studying man and you were going to move on to study woman."
Yes. It's quite interesting to study the transformation, the evolution of the English language. You know, if you go back to the 19th century, it's perfectly common to use man in the generic sense, to refer to all humans. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was the same, but sort of in the middle, it began to change. And so now, the Bible translators are faced with the dilemma. How do we deal with man anthropos? Anthropos being the Greek word that can be used for mankind. And it includes men and women. But used to be, you could just say man and women knew they were included. But now if you just say man, women don't know they're included. So if I'm going to communicate the gospel to them, I need to think about how can I do it so that they understand that they're included. Part of creation, part of the sinners, and part of those to be saved and loved by God.
Wait for the transgender movement, then you're going to say men, women,
and others, yeah.
But people need to work.
Carson uses a gender-neutral translation. I was listening to his quotations.
Yes, he uses the NIV, and the new NIV is gender-inclusive, gender-neutral. But there's also the Holman Christian Standard Bible. And I've mentioned this translation several times here. It is an excellent translation. It is very faithful to the Greek text. And where the Greek text has anthropos, the generic word for man, they will say brothers and sisters or men and women when all are included. But when it's man, like the husband is the head of his wife, they translate that faithfully. So there is something in between the old translation and the current NIV. So I wasn't pleased when Carson went that way, but I do respect his knowledge of the Greek text far more than my own. So,
What kind of translation is it?
well, it's now called, it used to be called the Holman Christian Standard Bible because Holman was the publisher that printed it. Holman. But now they're just calling it the CSB, Christian Standard Bible.
Yeah, they're remarketing it, it's like rebranding it, but it's the same translation, right?
It's essentially the same translation, but what I just described to you is the change
Okay.
that in the new translation. And it was just on Christianity Today website this week, or maybe it was on Al Mohler's website, where they said the Christian Standard Bible is gender inclusive. And they said, where it means both, we specify both so that people understand it, but it is still faithful to the original Greek. So you can't put it in exactly the same category as the new NIV. Bill?
Doc, there's a tremendous misunderstanding between the role of men and women. You know that.
I do know that.
And, you know, we're equal in Christ, as the book of Galatians teaches, but it's true, isn't it? The principle is this, that the man is supposed to be the leader or the priest of the home, so to speak, in leadership, etc. You know, that's difficult for women to handle and men to handle sometimes. You understand that, don't you, Doc? There's a lot of misunderstanding about the functions or the roles of the man and the women. And of course, God looked at Adam and he said, that's just a pile of dust and dirt, and he made Eve. And women are much smarter than men now, they really are. I don't know, I told Pastor Joe on the phone the other day, how in the world can a pastor be a pastor without a wonderful, wonderful wife like Nanette is to Paul? He should really appreciate her. Amen.
Well, it is rare, but
Amen, Paul.
it is rare, but there are exceptions to it. John Stott never married.
Yeah, there is
And he
a
was-
lot of misunderstanding.
Sarah?
I'd like to apologize, I didn't mean to start a rabbit trail.
Apology accepted. Okay, let's jump into what we're going to talk about here yet today. The question of the fall is very important because it describes us in our contemporary situation, describes man throughout his history. And this is extremely important to nail down, get clear before we go on to talk about salvation. Because what is it we need to be saved from? So this is what the fall helps us to see. Well, in second, I got it on the right page here. In Genesis 3, what God had promised in Genesis 2 was realized. What did God promise in Genesis 2:17? That they would die. And in fact, in Genesis 3:16, they did. So he said, if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat of it. That's the command. For in that day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Thus, man died. Spiritually, instantly. So we see the transformation, we see the change in man immediately after disobeying this command. Before God comes and confronts him, the change is already evident. He wants to hide. He covers himself. He hadn't been wearing any clothes before then. He didn't need any. But after the fall, he did need them. Something changed immediately. So spiritually, man died instantly. Physically, he began to die. And what I'm saying here is that man, as he was created, hear me well, was created to live forever. And that changed at the fall. So death entered the human race at the fall. Now, Adam and Eve didn't die that day physically, but they did die. So as you read through Genesis, you get to Genesis 5, which is the Toledot, the generations of Adam. And it's quite striking. This table of descent is different from any other in the Bible because it keeps making the expression, and he died, and he died, and he died. Well, the author is trying to emphasize something to us, that the judgment God spoke of in Genesis 2 is taking place in history. They're all dying. Yes, they have children, and the children have children, and so here we are. However many thousand years later, humanity is still on the face of the earth, but humanity dies. We all die. And we always feel like there's something inappropriate about death. My Aunt Pat, she was 87 years old. We stayed with her when we were in California for celebrating my mom's 90th birthday. Didn't know anything was wrong. She was her usual self. And we were gone for just a matter of a few weeks. And we found out that she'd been to the doctor and she had advanced cancer. So my mom, 90-year-old, sits by her bed day after day after day, weeps when I talk to her on the phone. Oh, she can't stand it. Pat is dying. Oh, Pat died. Pat was a Christian. She was 87 years old. That's a pretty good age. What's wrong with Pat dying? I mean, in one sense, nothing. We all come to an end of life. But there's something about death. My mom just couldn't stand it. Here's her younger sister dying before her. You know, there's this innate sense we have that there's something inappropriate about death. That doesn't have an explanation since death is so common. Totally common.
Say in the Revelation it says, the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death.
The last enemy. So death is an enemy. So in that respect, it makes sense what my mom was doing. Mourning, grieving over the loss of her sister because she was dying. My mom will die herself and go to be with her before long. But that wasn't what gripped her at the moment of the death. And that's because of the nature of death. Death is an enemy. And we sense that. And that's because of the way God made us. God put eternity in our hearts. And that's what we long for. Bill?
You know, I have a difficult time. I know that the unsaved or the lost are spiritually dead, but what about the Christian? In a sense, they're dead too. How would you describe a backslidden carnal Baptist or whatever? How would you describe?
I think I need to defer to Paul on that question.
Well, Ephesians talks about that. Wake up from the dead, you Christians. So a Christian, in a sense, can be spiritually dead, Doc.
But not in the sense that the non-believer is spiritually dead.
That's right, yeah.
Because if, in fact,
Yeah.
our spiritual birth gives us eternal life,
I know that, yeah.
then we're not spiritually dead any longer. We may live like the spiritually dead.
They're walking in the old flesh, the old sin nature.
Yes.
And
So
Satan knows.
Christians can live in Romans 7.
Okay.
And in Romans 7, the very good I want to do, I don't do.
They're grieving the Holy Spirit, quenching the Holy Spirit.
That's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay?
All knows that.
Trent,
All right.
you stop to think though that there was also the tree of life in the garden.
That's right.
To which the access to which they were barred, Adam and Eve, once they were cast from the garden. And in eternity, there will be the tree of life also.
Which we'll get to eat from then.
So the question that comes to my mind is, did they need that tree of life to sustain their life? You said they were created to live eternally forever, but did they need that tree of life to sustain their life to live eternally? And will we need the tree of life in eternity to sustain our life forever?
I don't know. I mean, that passage.
I don't know either.
That passage is a bit obscure, and it's a surprise because we're told about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but we're not told about the tree of life until after the fall, and then they're prevented from getting at it.
Right. And then
Because if they got at it with their sin, they would live forever spiritually dead.
yes.
And God did not. And that's His mercy that He did not permit that.
But the question is, that's a question I don't have any answer to either, but will we need that tree of life to sustain life in eternity? I don't know.
I don't know, but if we do, we'll get it. I feel confident about that.
Find out.
What is the tree that's the leaves are for the healing of the nations? Is that the same tree?
Same tree.
Art says it's the same tree. And I trust him.
Isn't the tree of life a symbol of Jesus?
Just a little question.
Yeah, you're asking me questions I've never been asked before here. I don't know. It's potentially possible, I would say. There are a number of, shall we call symbols or metaphors in the Old Testament that as the Jews experienced them and read them, they didn't know what it referred to. From the perspective of the New Testament, looking back at the Old, we can see some of these. For example, the one that Paul uses, the rock in the desert that was struck by Moses, that is a symbol of Christ who leads us but had to be struck in order to win our salvation. So those kinds of things do exist in the Old. You've got to be careful, though. Some people can interpret everything as a type of Christ. John Dell and then Sarah.
It was a symbol, but it also was a real rock, so it was both a symbol and a reality.
That's right. That's right. And that's why in biblical studies we usually call those types to distinguish between just a symbol and something that had reality but has prophetic significance. I mean, I think Joseph was a type of Christ who saved his people. But, he's not called that. Okay, Sarah.
I was going to say the same thing. I think we would agree that the tree of life is a symbol for Christ, but that doesn't mean
Right. Yeah. Good. Okay. So, the results of the fall. First of all, man began by rationalizing his sin, blaming others. This is a tendency that's deeply embedded in humanity. It's still going on. We always have somebody else to blame. We're not responsible. God did not permit that. I want to make a remark here about the effect of sin on sexuality. Sin did affect man in his totality, but we see it, I think, immediately with respect to his sexuality. And I've already pointed out that he immediately recognized that he was naked, and he sewed fig leaves together to cover his nakedness. I noticed we're all wearing clothes today, and I think that's a good thing. We do live in a fallen world, and I don't think we're getting back to paradise when we join nudist colonies. There is a very definite appropriateness to this. So the term shame is used in this respect. In German, das Schamgefühl. So while we lived in Germany, I heard lots of people talking against the feeling of shame, so that we should cast that off because it's a bad thing. And it doesn't belong to humanity because there's nothing to be ashamed of in the human body. Well, there's a piece of that that's true. There is nothing to be ashamed of in the human body. This is the way God designed it. But there is something wrong with exposing it in public, which not only the German society and the European society, but the American society is getting more and more liberal with, and not observing that shame. But the shame came as a natural consequence of the fall and will not be removed completely until the consummation of all things. Does that mean we're going to be running around naked in heaven? I don't think so. The picture I see in Revelation is we'll have white robes. So I'm not thinking we're going to go back to the garden. We're going to go forward to the fulfillment of God's ultimate plan for his creation. And I don't think that will include us running around without any clothes at all.
Doc, I've often wondered, we don't have any idea how long Adam and Eve were in the garden before they sinned, because apparently they didn't have any children before the fall.
That's correct. And for that reason, I think they were not very long in the garden before the fall. Because had they been there very long, there's no reason to expect they would have been childless. Because as perfect creations, reproduction would have worked perfectly.
Okay.
So I think the period of time between creation and the fall was quite short.
So Satan went to work right away on it.
Absolutely.
He's a devil, he's a deceiver.
He is a devil, a deceiver, and an accuser.
He's our enemy.
Sin had an effect on marriage. Now this is a little more difficult, and I can't believe I only brought a New Testament. So we need an Old Testament here. Somebody read to us Genesis 3:16, nice and loud.
To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you.
Okay, this little expression, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. What does that mean? There are two ways that this passage has been taken, and I'm going to argue now for the right way. Because it's the way I see it. You can think about it and decide. One way that's been argued here is this just shows the headship of the husband. And her desire for her husband is a good thing. It's good for women to desire their husbands, right? Trouble is, the word for desire here in the Hebrew text and the word for rule are not positive words. They're negative words. So the actual desire referred to in this passage is the desire to rule. So the same expression is used in Genesis 4 to refer to when God is speaking with Cain, prefer to sin. And sin's desire is to rule over you. So I think the desire being referred to here is not the positive desire that a woman has for her husband, but her desire to rule over her husband. But it says, he will rule over you. What kind of rule is this? Well, this is a more negative term for rule, like dominate. So what we see here is not a command, but a prediction. This will be human experience down through the centuries. And it has been human experience. Women have been dominated, lorded over, abused, and men have abused their power and strength over women. And to justify it by this verse, I think is a serious mistake, because this verse is not saying this is what should be. This is the consequence of sin. And sin makes people want to rule over others rather than to relate in a healthy way. So when Paul writes in Ephesians 5 that the husband is the head of his wife, what does he say? He doesn't say the head rules over his wife. He says that he loves her like Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So the kind of marriage that God wants does include a head, but it includes one who sacrificially loves on the pattern of Christ's sacrificial love for the church.
And
Tracy?
the consequence of that type of love is the natural inclination of the spouse to want to be led. And that's what I see.
Yes, and I agree with you completely. However, I don't want to overlook the reality of the challenge that women have in submitting. I don't think submission is easy. And that is what they're called to do in Ephesians 5. But it is much easier for a woman to submit to a husband who loves her sacrificially than to one who dominates and lords it over her. So headship is not the drill sergeant. It's not the dictator. Headship is a loving servant leader. Lynn?
Well, Jesus summed it up over mankind. He said, the Gentiles, even love the Lord over everyone.
Right.
And it's not just a marriage relationship. This is the effect of sin. When it says the woman's desire, she's wanting to be competitive too.
Yes.
And he's going to be a bully because he's bigger and stronger.
That's right.
He'll have the upper hand.
Yeah.
It's just talking about the sin nature.
So the sin nature exploits nature. Men are bigger and stronger than women, and so the sin nature makes them use that nature to dominate and get their will. Sarah and Roxanne and Bill and okay, go.
I realize you're coming up there, so sorry if this is going into where you want to be. But I'd say it's equally hard, perhaps if not harder, to submit to somebody who won't lead or doesn't lead.
That's a good point. It's a very good point. Yeah. Which means that when the husband, in the case of marriage, fails to fulfill his responsibility, he makes it hard for his wife to fulfill her responsibility. I don't think that excuses her, nor does it excuse a man when his wife refuses to submit. He's still to be the head. That's what God assigned to him, that role. Roxanne.
My question is that word for, because I have a footnote in my Bible that says it can also be translated against, desire to be against your husband. I don't know language translation if
That's what I was getting at when I said the kind of desire that's talked about here is not the positive desire. And the against idea, I think, is present in it. Bill?
Some people accuse the Apostle Paul of being a male chauvinist.
Mm-hmm. They do. That's true.
I don't understand that, I think Paul loved women.
I'm sure he did. Look at the book of Acts. Look at the book of Acts and the way Paul honored them and used them in ministry. Roz.
saying that both roles are impossible without God.
directions, but the main thing we need is to say, Holy Spirit, you are welcome in this relationship. Help!
It's not by accident that Ephesians 5:18 and 19 says, be not drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. Because being filled with the Spirit, that comes right before the commands to marriage. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. The results of the fall. We never finished a lesson. There was a curse on creation, and this is going to take longer than we have right now. But I want to just say today, before we conclude, that man's sin had consequences not just for humanity, but for the creation. We see it in Genesis 3 when God is pronouncing, you're going to earn your living by the sweat of your brow, and you're going to have to deal with thorns and thistles. Were there thorns and thistles in the garden? Well, the implication is no, there were no thorns and thistles. Everything that was there was beautiful and fruitful. But the creation became fallen. And Paul tells us then in Romans 8, of course, that the whole creation cries out for release, for redemption of the sons of God. So the creation's renewal, contrary to what the environmentalists would like you to believe, will not happen until mankind's redemption is complete. The two are tied together. So the redemption of believers, the redemption of the body of Christ, Christians, that will be brought to its consummation as described in the book of Revelation, will bring with it what Revelation also declares, a new heaven and a new earth that's not fallen anymore. Selah. That's it for today. We'll pick up next week.
Thank you, Doc. You're doing a good job.